So I'm just really excited to be here to talk to you about land management and restoration tools to address wind erosion. And so I'm going to be talking about these large-scale tools that are meant to address the problem at this large regional scale. These are not the only tools that exist. They're not always the best tools, and they're also not meant to replace on-the-ground knowledge that I know so many of you in this room have. But it's really important to know what tools are out there, and I hope by the end you are as excited about them and the potential that they provide as I am. And so I'm going to talk about kind of these 4 big understandings that we need to have in order to address wind erosion. And as I talk, all of the examples are going to be coming from this place. So this is the Jornada Basin in Las Cruces, near Las Cruces in southern New Mexico. And so have this landscape in your mind, but I invite all of you to conjure a place of land that you know really well and think about how the information I'm talking about might be relevant to a place that you know and that you care about and want to not see blow away. And so there are important things to understand to address wind erosion. And the first thing that you really need to understand is the characteristics of the soil that you're on. What is the soil texture? How much organic matter is there? How is the soil being held together? And this is a really important thing because those characteristics are going to affect the amount of movement that soil that can occur on that soil. So here's a map of that Jornada Basin, that pretty picture I just showed you. And each of the different colors is a different soil type. So some of these soils are sandy, some of these soils are gravelly or loamy soils. And importantly, each of these different soil types are going to have a different baseline level of amount of movement of soil that can come off of these different soil types. So the larger the hump in this little graph here, the more sediment that can move from these soil textures. So you see sandy soils have that nice big mountain shape. That means there's a lot more sediment that can move from sandy soils than, say, from gravelly soils. So this is really important in order to understand management and restoration of land to be able to reduce wind erosion or restore it after it's already occurred. There's this incredible tool that already exists called the Ecosystem Dynamics Interpretive Tool, or EDIT. And what it does is it uses the NRCS Soil Survey, and it exists all over the United States, and it allows you to look at an area of land and understand the soil properties of that area of land, and then you can relate that to how that relates to the susceptibility of soil to wind erosion. So there's a tool that is here to help us understand the first thing we need to know about how to address wind erosion on a specific site. The next thing, so we've centered ourselves, we know what our soil type is and its susceptibility to wind erosion. The next thing we need to be thinking about is our vegetation characteristics. So how much ground cover is there? What is the height of the vegetation? How is it dispersed on the landscape? All of these are going to affect wind erosion. And I bet you all can intuitively look at these pictures and know which one of these sites is going to be more susceptible to wind erosion. That this site here has a lot more grass cover, a lot less bare ground than the other site. That's going to be a lot less susceptible to wind erosion. And so all of you who spend time on the land, you intuitively know these things about the landscape, but these things can be very difficult to monitor at large spatial scales. As Nick and Mackenzie and everybody's been talking about, these things are occurring at huge scales, and so there's a need for large-scale monitoring and monitoring through time. And so there are incredibly exciting, I hope you get as excited as I am, tools that allow us to start doing this. And so there's the Landscape Data Commons has taken all of the monitoring data that is available on public lands and private lands and compiled it into one place so that we can start knowing the vegetation monitoring data, so we can start knowing about vegetation characteristics across large areas. And this is a continually updated a monitoring data set that's being continually updated. And so each of these little dots is a monitoring location. And once you have this on-the-ground knowledge, you can combine it with information from satellites and start doing some really cool remote sensing work that allows you to look at landscapes through time. Nick showed a picture of this with bare soil. Here's a picture of this with vegetation. So this is the Rangelands Analysis Platform, and it gives you the the annual, so yearly mean cover of different plant groups all the way back to 1986. So that is just like an incredibly cool data set to have, to be able to understand landscapes and how they're changing and how that relates to the susceptibility to wind erosion. So here we are back at the Jornada. We have the red dot is a specific location on the land, and so at that latitude and longitude, this tool lets us know that the perennial, so the year-round forbin grass cover at that site is 22%. That should, in your heart, your response should be, oh my gosh, that's really low. And so what that means is there's not a lot of ground cover, and so that site is very susceptible to wind erosion. These are really important things to be able to understand that we can do with these large-scale tools. The third thing that we really need to understand to address wind erosion is how disturbances change the vegetation characteristics. So these systems are not static, they're changing through time. And sometimes large-scale disturbances, for example, a catastrophic wildfire or the introduction of like a very heavy grazing season, can push an ecosystem past a threshold. So vegetation characteristics are constantly oscillating. Sometimes there'll be more cheatgrass, sometimes there'll be less cheatgrass. You know, things are changing within their little cup in this diagram. But these large-scale disturbances can push ecosystems past the threshold, which is this dotted line, and it can be a new ecological state, is what we call it, a whole new arrangement of the plant community. And when that happens, that's going to dramatically change an area's susceptibility to wind erosion and the types of actions you would take to restore it. And so on the same soil type, each of these different vegetation communities can exist, right? And we now have the tools from that rangeland analysis platform that I was just talking about to be able to say, you know, roughly what the composition of the plant communities are on the landscape, and then we can be able to start knowing how that relates to wind erosion. And so this figure is just showing these different plant communities that I was just talking about, and the box over on the bottom corner, that's showing the total horizontal flux, just like what Nick was talking about, the amount of sediment moving, and how the amount of sediment that's moving is different depending on what ecological state you're in. And so understanding the ecological state is key to understanding what actions need to happen in order to restore and manage the land sustainably. You following? And so this is not like a hypothetical graph, this is data from that exact same site where we have the vegetation cover down here and the amount of soil movement. And so when there's very little vegetation, there's a ton of soil movement. I know, it's crazy. And then when there's a lot of vegetation, you have very little soil movement. And so this is that 30% is this kind of benchmark, this place at which you don't want to cross, because you see that then the amount of sediment moving goes much higher when you get below 30% vegetation cover. And again, I just want to impart, this isn't hypothetical, this is based off of data that we can collect about a site to say what that benchmark is and that we should not cross it. And so what we want to do, you know, when we have larger amounts of cover of vegetation, is that we want to be practicing sustainable land management to reduce the likelihood of wind erosion. When we're on this side of that benchmark, what we really want to be doing is focusing on restoration or rehabilitation of the system in order to stabilize soils. Sustainable land management is the gold star, right? Once we have crossed these benchmarks, putting a landscape back together is incredibly difficult, especially in these dry places. And so sustainable land management, to reduce the pressures on systems and reduce the possibility of increasing wind erosion, is what we want to be doing on the land. And what that means is adaptability in the timing, intensity, and duration of land use. And so these are just two initiatives that currently exist that are attempting to do that. So the Southwest Sustainable Beef is looking into different technologies that exist that would allow us to practice sustainable ranching in our region. And then there are also different ways of knowing to think about what sustainability is. So the Native American Rangelands Partnership offers an indigenized form of range management that provides multiple knowledge systems to tackle a very complex problem. So in this upper corner, back when thinking about the different ecological states that can exist on a piece of soil, up here where we have this large amount of vegetation cover, we can practice that sustainable land management and maintain that cover and create a more resilient system to wind erosion. When we are in this orange area, that's when we really need to be thinking about active and sometimes aggressive restoration action to stabilize the soil. So the size of the arrow at each of these boxes represents kind of the amount of input required to stabilize soils and get the system to a place where our soils are remaining in place and not blowing onto the mountains and creating dust on snow, which is what we're all here talking about. So really, I just wanted to give you kind of a rapid-fire overview to tell you kind of these high-level things that you probably all of you who are working with land are already intuitively thinking about when you're thinking about how to manage land. But make sure everybody knows that there are these tools that are increasingly useful and increasingly relevant to how we think about managing wind erosion and managing land to increase its resistance to these kinds of processes. There are a lot of key questions that remain. I invite all of you to come tell me your thoughts and your experiences on the land during our next break. Tell me about where you see gaps in this framework. How can this complement on-the-ground knowledge that I know all of you have? And then also, we need to be actively thinking about testing, experimenting with which restoration actions are the most appropriate when land is in its different ecological states to reduce wind erosion. And definitely stay tuned. This afternoon, the Cortez group is going to be talking a lot about this with a lot of really cool, innovative solutions. So I encourage everyone to be there for that. And I think I probably don't have time for questions because I like to talk. But I thank you all so much for listening, and I'm excited to talk with you all.